I'm very happy to, there are many reasons for which I'm happy to introduce Philippe Aghion. And one of the main reasons is that he was supposed to come to give his lecture 5 years ago. Those remember 2013, particularly April and May 2013, were difficult times, so it didn't happen. Apologies, but we are delighted that Philippe, it took 5 years to redo these things, and we are very happy that he's here. Look, you know, the resume of Philippe is a long one. I don't even try to do this thing. I just say one thing, actually maybe two things, three things at a time. But anyway, so Philippe is just like, to make it short, is one of the most influential and better known economists of this generation. So even if we wouldn't be here, I would say the same thing. He is definitely made this mark in so many things, but in particular in terms of growth and theory of contracts. And if we just list of his appointments and publications, so he has been professor at MIT, in Harvard for so many years. He was Wagner Professor of Economics in Harvard. He's now in London School of Economics. Before that, he was in London. Where have you been in London? UCL. Also, thank you. Yeah, it's good to have people who know these things. So so in Paris School of Economics, and one of the important things actually, I think you still are doing in Institute of France.
Collège
de France. Well, so there are so many things. But anyway, that's this contribution is so remarkable and so deep that we really delighted. We always, and actually he's a friend of New Economic School, has been for a very long time, has been here before, and now we are very happy to have him here. And yeah, so many things, but anyway, thank you for coming, in spite of some difficulties on the way, on the road, but the main thing you are here, and we are very happy to have you here.
Yeah. Thank you very much. So, it's an honor for me to be here, and and in fact I knew Zvi really Kes very well because you know I studied at Harvard and he was a professor there, and then I've been very much influenced by him because in fact my agenda has been a lot on innovation and growth, and I've worked a lot on his papers. And I worked a lot with people, you know, he started a whole school with people you know, with, you know, Mark Schenkerman, Ariel Pekes, Bronwyn Hall, Jacques Mérès, and all these are very close friends to me. And so Zvi is, well, it's been very important in my life. And also when the new economic school was created, I had been involved in the setting up of something similar called Serge in Prague, and so we were talking a lot to each other about Serge versus NES and all that, and so it was the early days of transition, and well, that was another opportunity, and and I know, I mean, you know, when Zvi got sick, and so people who were working on the first shift for him, and Mark Schenkerman, who I'm very, very close to, was, you know, on daily contact with Zvi, and voilà. And so Zvi has been extremely influential, and I think he set up an agenda which will be long-lasting. So it will have a very important influence on the profession for many years to come. So what I will do here is to talk a bit about what I've been doing on growth and innovation over the past 30 years. The story started, so already when I was a student at Harvard, Zvi was there, so he would talk a lot about innovation. I would take some I/O course, and you will listen about Schumpeter. The name Schumpeter would come, but there was no, you know, when you would learn growth theory, you would learn about Solow and Ramsey, but you would and you would use the Pontryagin principle, which is very nice, but you know, there was, well, if you wanted to know what are the determinants of growth, why some countries grow faster than others, why some countries overtake other countries, why some countries start to grow and converge and then stop. If you wanted to ask all these questions, there wasn't much you could get out of the Solow model and the Ramsey model to answer those questions. And so, but of course, I mean, you know, Solow is the benchmark. I mean, what's very nice with the Solow model is that it's a very parsimonious model because growth is described by two equations. You have a first equation that tells you how you produce final good using capital stock and labor stock. And there is a second equation that tells you how capital accumulates over time as a result of savings minus depreciation. And it's a very elegant model, and it's the benchmark, and you cannot teach a growth course without talking about the Solow model. It's a model of a model also. It's a way to say, well, try to be parsimonious, try to, and there is a lot that can be done with the Solow model, and both by growth economists, by development economists, and you can do growth accounting, you can do development accounting, and there is a lot that you can do with it. But Solow also needed to explain that under reasonable assumptions on capital accumulation, in particular if you assume decreasing returns to capital accumulation, you cannot get long-run growth of per capita GDP because essentially you run out of steam. Moving from 0 to 1 machine, you increase output a lot, but moving from 9 machines to 10 machines, you don't increase output by much. And but the depreciation is at a constant rate, and at some point, as you accumulate capital, depreciation catches up with savings, and at this time you stop growing. And the main point of Solow, this is the first page of his QJE paper that gave him the Nobel Prize in '87. A main point of that paper was to show that without technical progress, you cannot get long-run growth. So you need of per capita GDP. So you need, in order to counteract the effects of decreasing returns to capital accumulation, you need something else, which is technical progress that would keep growth going. The problem is that Solow did not explain where technical progress was coming from. In fact, even with the assumptions of his model, because of the Euler theorem, once you remunerate labor and capital at their marginal productivity, there is nothing left to remunerate anything else like technical progress, okay? All that you know, and I won't repeat that, but that's where we started from. But you see what's very interesting is that, then of course you would have the Ramsey model and all the sophistications of Solow, but with not much more insights that you had in Solow already. And the issue is that, on the other hand, in IO, I would hear about Schumpeter, but there is where is the model? But there is no model. Where is the empirics? Well, at the time I didn't know much about empirics, although there was some empirics, which was what Zvi was doing, and his school. Zvi was the pioneer there. Okay, and so what I did then is to I wanted to put imperfect competition in growth already when I wrote my endorsement, my statement of purposes at Harvard in '83, and I was there in '84. I said I want to put imperfect competition in growth economics, and I want to put IO. And IO, I had learned a bit with Jean Tirole, who had already a book in French that I read in Paris. And then I took his class when he was at MIT and I was starting at Harvard. So I did my PhD at Harvard. It was called 3 Essays on the Theory of Industrial Organization. So I worked on the theory of organization. That's how also I did contract theory. But I wanted to put that in growth. So when I arrived at MIT in September '87, my neighbor was Peter Howitt. Peter Howitt was a professor at Western Ontario, and he was visiting that year MIT. So we would talk to each other, and one day I came to his office and look, Peter, why don't we try to have a model inspired by the Schumpeter idea, and see where we get with this model. And that has been the beginning of a big adventure that led us very far. And in fact, we explored in many directions, and then we saw now young generations using this framework and developing it. And I will talk about development. So I talk not only about my staff, but the staff of younger people who have developed what now we call the Schumpeterian growth paradigm in various directions. Okay, so here is the guy we try to. To be honest with you, I've never read Schumpeter properly, never. I got some ideas and said, well, those things, well, we could do something with this. And I never took the time to read Schumpeter. I had read his history of economic thought, but I never read properly Schumpeter. So when people say, what do you think what Schumpeter says? I have no clue. I mean, I did my own thing, actually. You see what I mean? And I've been maybe too modest and say Schumpeter and model. I should have said from the start Aguillon-Howitt. And but in fact, what I took is Aguillon-Howitt, and the subsequent to Aguillon-Howitt. We call that now Schumpeter and growth. But in fact, I have to be, you know, to acknowledge that I know very little about this guy. I should learn. I should start reading him at some point. Okay. So the theory that we built with Howitt was based on three main ideas. One is that long-run growth is driven by innovation. So that was the kind of, you know, mirror of Solow. Solow tells you without technical progress, you cannot have long-run growth. So first thing is that you need innovation to have long-run growth. Second idea, innovation do not come from heaven. They result from entrepreneurial activities motivated by the search for monopoly rents, or at least temporary monopoly rents if you innovate. So it's because you want to gain something that you innovate. And of course, there are other motivations to innovation. But in particular, you expect to make a profit. You say, I invent a better product, a better way to do things, better way to organize production. I will get some rents out of it, okay, at least for a while, until I'm imitated or until I'm replaced. And that's a very important point, because it means that institutions and policies will impact on growth because they will affect the incentives to engage in innovation. You see, if you are in a world where you know, you are if you are in Zimbabwe under Mugabe, you don't do anything because you are expropriated. You see, you don't have any incentive. If you are in you know, in a place where you have hyperinflation, you know that the hyperinflation will eat up all what you've done. So you won't have innovation. So it's a very interesting sentence, because there already you can talk about policy of growth and institutions of growth. And for example, people like Acemoglu, Robinson and all that, they've talked about institutions, and other people, and North and others, and that's where it fits. Institutions affect growth because they affect the incentives to engage in innovative activities, okay? So property right protection, education system, taxation system, etc. will impact on growth because, yes?
Sure, but here in Russia, if you're rich, you can bribe people, you can do anything, you can do things that you
No, I had Russia on the top of my tongue, but I said, would I wait a bit for talking about Russia, and before that the Soviet Union. So I think we'll have a big discussion on that. But I suggest that I speak for more or less 1 hour. Me, I have no time limit, so we can stay longer, and we can discuss about Russia, the Soviet Union, communism. You know, that's also been part of my own political life. So I mean, we can have a fun discussion actually on that. Okay, maybe with all what I will say, I won't go back to France. I don't know. Okay, so the third point is creative destruction. So the idea there is that new technologies, new innovations displace old technologies. And that's a very important point, is the idea that the new is better than the old. And therefore, innovation is a conflicting process between the old and the new. And that's very important because you can talk about political economy of growth. You see what I mean? And again, when why nations fail, it's about, you know, some countries manage that, okay, they let new people come. Other countries, they don't let new people come. And they don't have innovation-based growth. And it's a very important consideration, because you see, at the heart of the growth process, and we will see that repeatedly tomorrow and the day after in my lectures, is that the innovators of yesterday, they tend to become entrenched incumbent today. And they will try to use their ranks to prevent new entry and new innovation. And that's the difficulty of the exercise, is that you want a system where you induce innovation. You say, well, if you succeed to innovate, you will make grants to reward your innovation. But on the other hand, there is the danger that those rents could be used for putting entry barriers or to buy out governments to prevent new innovation. And we will see that that contradiction plays out everywhere. When we talk about inequality, when we talk about competition, when we talk, always we will find that problem there. You see, when we talk about middle income trap, we will see that problem surfacing each time. You see, and that's a very important thing. And that's the growth model we build with Howitt, okay? And my feeling is that we are passing the Darwinian test. I think the young people who work on growth increasingly work on this kind of models. But we will see, I mean, only history will tell. But that's fun. Why is it fun? Because you talk about policy and institutions of growth. You talk about political economy of growth. And it's a growth model that you use firm-level data to estimate it. You move away from the cross-country regression of other people, I don't name anybody, and you go into micro estimation of growth. Okay, so that's what the agenda is. That's what we've done. And so this is someone who is a young generation, Ufuk. He does a lot of work, but there are other people. There is Pete Clino, and there is Chiang Tai-sei, and there is a whole young generation of people who work on these Schumpeterian models now, actually. And they are, I call them my creative destruction. Okay. So, for example, what's very interesting is that Ufuk, with co-authors, has produced work based on historical American data, going back to 1840. Here it shows, you know, the horizontal axis, you have residualized log patents, so it's a log of patenting across states. You see, those are US states. And then on average, annually between 1900 and 2000. And on the vertical axis, you have the average annual GDP growth rate between 1900 and 2000. And you see, well, that's a correlation, but it's interesting that indeed innovation and growth have something to do empirically on historical data. You see, the first thing I told you before is that long-run growth is driven by innovation. Well, there is empirical evidence. Now you could say this is just a correlation, but in that paper, which is called American Ingenuity, they have instruments. They use, you know, they use military contracts to instrument for innovation, and they confirm a causal relationship between innovation and growth. It's nice to have that on historical data. What's very interesting is that this study is only 2 years old. There was no true study on historical data showing a causal relationship from innovation to growth. Now that exists, okay. Huh?
How do we know it's causal?
How do you what?
How do we know it's causal?
Because they have an ID. That's the thing. Well, unless then we can discuss the ID, okay?
Yeah.
Voilà.
Yes.
Okay. Similarly, they look at the relationship between bank deposit per capita and patenting, and they see that financial development here measured by bank development is positively correlated with innovation. Okay, so there are various types of exercises. I will not define their paper, but it's interesting that you find evidence which is consistent with the fact that growth is driven by innovation, as innovation is driven by institutions. Here they look at financial development. Of course, there will be many other studies looking at financial development and growth by Levin. I have a whole survey with Ross Levin and Peter Howitt where we talk about this evidence on financial development and innovation. Okay, I could do 3 lectures on that topic. Okay, I don't have the time and space.
Right,
Okay.
It also looks potentially endogenous. Yes.
Sorry.
It also looks potentially.
Yeah, but for example, what you do in finance, you can, when you have recent data, you can, for example, do like Rajan Zingales do. You see, you can do Rajan Zingales, of course, with its limits. And another things you can do, you can use, for example, measures, policy measures to instrument. Like, for example, Draghi, when he does the outright monetary transaction, things that make credit easier, and you look at how these things affect. So now we know we do much more sophisticated stuff.
Rational efficiency knowledge is overturned.
No, and now what's what you do the other things, which is like regression discontinuity. You put OMT or you put other measures and you see how those things affect. Okay. Okay. You want you know, you will have hard time with me. Because you can imagine, I mean, you know, I've been working at that for 30 years, and I'm very happy to go to your questions, but I can imagine that I don't come here. It's true, I lost my luggage, but I didn't lose completely my head. Okay. Here they have a correlation between percentage of people living in urban area and innovation, and living in urban area is also something that favors innovation. Okay, so one prediction of the Schumpeterian model, forget about the lambda z and g, because that's driven from a model, but the first prediction of the model is that you have a positive correlation between turnover and growth rate in developed countries. That means whenever you have more entry and exit, you tend to have more growth, because growth in the Schumpeterian model is driven by innovation, and the prediction of that model is that turnover, for example, you take Davis-Alty-Wenger type of data, you will see that in the areas where you have more turnover, you tend to have also a higher growth rate. That's something that, for example, the Romer model would not give you, or any other model would not give you. That's prediction 0 of Schumpeterian model that already says, okay, we are better than the other models. Okay, so I come here very strongly saying, look, there have been other attempts, I'm better than the other guys. Of course, you are free to disagree, but I think this model delivers a number of things that the other models don't deliver. Okay, then history will tell. Okay. Okay, so I will now, what I will do the rest of the lecture is to mention some enigmas that the Schumpeterian framework can shed light on. So I will talk about 3 enigmas today, but I will deal in detail 2 more enigmas tomorrow and Wednesday, okay? So today I will talk about growth and competition, the middle income trap, and growth and farm dynamics. But then I will deal with 2 more enigmas, tomorrow and the day after. Tomorrow I will talk about the debate on secular stagnation, about Gordon, and growth measurement. That will be my tomorrow. And the day after, I will talk about Piketty and inequality, and why I disagree with Piketty. Okay? What's the difference between us? And the relationship between innovation-based growth, inequality, and social mobility. That's the menu, that's what I will be seeing. And I know I have a public lecture, I have to talk about Macron and growth, but that, my notes, I have to reinvent them, they're in my luggage that I lost. So that's, so I will have to remember a bit. Okay, thank you very much. Okay, so let me talk about growth and competition. So growth and competition, you see, the first model what we did, and that's shared with the Romer model actually, it was that, you know, to the extent that innovation will be generated by R&D investment or other type of investment motivated by monopoly rents, anything that would reduce monopoly rents would be bad for innovation and therefore bad for growth. So the very first model that we did, the 92 model with Howitt, but the 90 model of Romer and other models would share the same thing, would say competition is bad for growth because it discourages. And in fact, when you talk, for example, I know that apparently, you know, not Steve Jobs, the one of, my God, you know, I forget the names. The one of Microsoft.
Bill Gates.
Bill Gates. Bill Gates, when he had to face antitrust cases, he would say, well, you know, if you be tough on antitrust, you discourage future Bill Gates because you reduce our rents.
Who was the famous economist that testified in favor of Microsoft in that case?
I forgot. It's not me. It's not me. Who was it? Who? Schmalensee? Yeah, well, he needed money. He's a good guy, Schmalensee. I never went into these kind of things. I always said, no, I won't do that. Although he has a business school salary, but obviously college is very costly there. Of course. Okay, anyway, I respect Schmalensee. But so the prediction of those models would be that competition is bad for growth because it reduces the rents and reward successful innovators. But there we had our first challenge because, in fact, empirical work that Richard Blondel did with John Van Reenen and Rachel Griffiths, but there was also parallel work by Steve Nicol in the mid-90s, showed that if anything, based on UK data, you would find positive relationship between competition and growth. Competition will be measured by the learner index by 1 minus ranks over value added, okay, or by measure of, well, this kind of measure. And they would find that competition was positively correlated with growth. So there we face the challenge. The theory seemed to be wrong. So what do you do then? Well, some people would just ignore the empirics. They say, these guys, you know, the greedy case of this world, we don't pay attention, okay? And that was not the attitude we have. We took very seriously, Howitt and I and other people, the criticism of the Blondel thing. And we said there is something missing in our basic framework. And when we found what was missing, so what we did, and that was very important in my you know what I will do? I will also try some Strepsil. That really started me doing growth differently is that I said, well, I have to do a dialogue with empiricists. You see what I mean? I cannot just do models. I have to dialogue with empiricists. How would the dialogue work? I would do a model. The model would have some predictions and something go wrong. I go back to my model. I change a few things. There are several ways of changing the model to reconcile with the facts. But each different way of doing the model will have new predictions and I would test them. So I tried several attempts to reconcile the Schumpeterian framework with this fact of Blondel. And we converged to what was working well. So here I show you the story that works. I don't show you another story that doesn't work, in fact, okay? And the story is as follows. In the basic model that we had with Howitt, but it was true also with the Romer model, innovations would always be made by outsiders. So they would go from 0 to pi. You see, I can write on the whiteboard there. They would go from 0 to pi. So anything that would reduce pi would reduce the incentive to innovate. But in practice, innovations are made also by people who are already in the market. They already make a profit. They go from pi 0 to pi 1. So it may well be that innovation, that competition reduces pi 1, but it may also reduce pi 0 by more. And what counts is the difference. Do you see what I mean? That's what counts for the incentive to innovate. Is the net gain, is the net profit. So imagine that you are a classroom, and everybody, so here you are all equally good. I can see that. But suppose that some people are better than others, okay? And they already make ranks. And suppose I open the door and I introduce someone who is very good. What will happen? The top of the class will work harder to beat the entrant. The bottom of the class, who is already discouraged, will be even more discouraged if the guy comes in. So you can see that those who are frontier, the best, will react positively to competition. Those who are behind, the laggards, will react negatively to competition. In the model, the basic model, I only have laggards. It was only outsiders that would do innovation. Never people who are at the frontier. You understand? So we extended the model to have a model where you have both frontier guys and non-frontier guys, and you see how competition affects them. And that's what we did. And the first prediction we get is that here you have the blue curve and the orange curve. The blue curve is the people who are close to the technological frontier. You see, they are the firms, and we know what it means. Their productivity is close to the maximum productivity in the sector. Those guys react positively. Innovation and growth react positively to competition. But the orange firms, which are the ones which are far below the frontier, they react negatively. So that's the first prediction that we got. And then we went back with Blondel, and we did a joint paper with Blondel called Competition and Innovation, an Inverted U relationship. And we found this effect. You see what I mean? And a second prediction that we could look at the overall effect. And we saw that the overall effect was an inverted U. And the second prediction of our extended model is that at low level of competition is the escape competition effect. I mean, is the effect on the blue firms that dominate. when you have already a lot of competition, the effect that dominates is what we call the Schumpeterian effect, which is the effect that dominated in the basic model. And you can see that when you do the overall thing, you have an inverted U curve. And again, we tested the inverted U. You see? So it was very interesting because we started a dialogue between theorists and empiricists. We brought to the empiricists forced us to redo our model. Then we went back with new prediction, and we found that it was true. They would never have thought of looking at the inverted U or at this thing without and there is a third thing we got out of it, is the complementarity, don't worry about the table, between patent protection and product market competition. Usually on this debate, there are those who, like Bill Gates, who say, well, if you believe in patent protection, you should not have antitrust. You should not have competition policy, because competition policy would undo what patent policy does. But then you have people like Baldwin and Levin who would say, well, I believe in competition, therefore you should not have patents. But both agreed that one was the flip side of the other. But in fact, there is complementarity between the two. And I have a recent paper with Howitt and Prentice in Journal of Economic Growth, and you show that the two are complementary. You have a positive interaction between competition policy and product market competition. And it's in the third row, the fourth row, protection interacted with product market. It's there. But the thing is very simple. Patent policy will increase by 1. Competition policy will reduce by 0. You see what I mean? When you have more competition policy, it reduces a lot the rents of someone who does not innovate. If you have patent protection, it enhances the rents of someone who innovates. Both contribute to increase the difference by 1 minus by 0. You see? And now you can understand there why you can have complementarity between patent policy and competition policy. Okay? That's an enigma I worked on for 15 years, 10 years, 15 years. It was a big deal, quoi. And you know, that's very interesting because at the end of the lecture, I will tell you that now these insights from this extension have now percolated to trade. Are there any trade economists among you? Okay. I'm sure you've seen the recent papers by Bloom, Draka, Van Drienen.
Yes, yes.
Okay, and Autor et al. We would find opposite things. It's a mess. Yes. Okay, but both cite my paper, so I'm very happy. So I'm in good terms with everyone that cites me. Okay, no, I'm just kidding. But I'm now redoing with Melitz. But also with Melitz, we did the effects on exports on competition. And I just want to show you very quickly the effect on exports. So let me show you. So you see this thing, it keeps becoming important. Save. Alors, let me show you. Okay. So what we find with Melitz is the following. We use French firms. We have an exhaustive French firm level data. Okay? All the slides and papers will be diffused here. Okay? So we have we have data. You see, we have patent data, we have firm level accounting data for all firms in France. We know from the French customs who exports where. Okay? And we look at the effect of export market on innovation, okay? And we match firm level data and custom data to patent data, okay? So, and the thing is, the main finding is here. We regress innovation of a firm on an index of competition. So this index of competition, this is, so we look at the firm, and the firm exports in various markets. But the various markets have their export size affected, okay? So for example, I export to China and Russia, okay? But suddenly something happens to Russia and China, which is independent of my firm. For example, it could be the GDP of Russia and China. But it could be also something measured by how much these countries import from other countries than France, which is completely independent from me. Okay, there is something happened at the market size. Okay, and what I do is to regress innovation in my firm based on you see, what I do is to regress my innovation, firm F at time t, on this variable called DFT, which is the export shock. So you see, I am exposed. Oh my God, I am exposed. You see, I will show you how I do that. I'll just show you okay. You see, I am exposed to several markets. So S is a product. I am firm F, and firm F at time t. And I export in various countries S, and I export various products S. So GIS is a product. It's a product in a country which the firm F exports. Okay, and I look at the import. It's a kind of either could be the GDP or the imports of products S from all the world except France. So okay, so I do that for any country S, any product S in country J that I export, and of course I weight by the ratio of my exports of product S to country J over all my exports, and of course I give more weight to a firm that exports more as a result of its total production. It's essentially it's a variable of the size of export markets, which I weight by how much I export to this country versus this country, and which I weight by how much exports are important for me compared to everything else. It could be that I export just the epsilon in Russia and epsilon prime in China, and the rest I just produce for domestic. So then this is irrelevant, of course, okay? So you do that, and what is nice is that you find this, you see. I find that what I call demand is this shock. And you find that if decile is how close you are to the technological frontier. So if you have a low decile, you are very much laggard. If you have a high decile, you are a frontier firm. And the beauty is that you find that if, forget about the interaction, if your decile is 0 or 1, you are a firm lagging. In fact, the overall effect of an expansion in the export market is to have your innovation reduced. If I only had a market size effect, they would increase the innovation. But they don't, because there is a counteracting, there is a direct market size effect, but there is a counteracting competition effect, because when size of China goes up, more firms go into China, and they become my competitors. And that will discourage me when I am very much lagging. You understand? But when my decile is high, and I am very frontier, you see the positive interaction is highly positive, and then you can see that the overall effect is positive, because in that case, the competition effect either is only slightly negative or even positive. I innovate to escape competition. So all firms have the direct market size effect, but you on top of that have a competition effect, and of course the competition effect will play out very differently from frontier firms and non-frontier. But those are exactly the same ideas as the one I had shown before. It's like the curve going blue and the curve going orange, you understand? What's very interesting in economics, it took 15 years for the trade economists to discover the paper with me and Peter of 2005, which was written in the late 90s. You see only papers dating 2 years ago that have these ideas in trade. And what's amazing that people like Grossman-Hellman were working on this, and they read Agnon-Owitt 92, because they saw it in 88, but they never read the 2001, 2005, fortunately I would say. But, and so that was and you see, and only now these things is percolating in trade economics. And the imports paper by Autor and the other guy are also trying to say, well, it could be that imports, but create competition, they can have a negative effect if it discourages, or a positive effect if it encourages. Autor et al. Find a negative effect, and Bloom-Draka find a positive effect. And so the way they try to rationalize that is to say, well, we are on different sides of the inverted U. In fact, Bloom and Draka, they look at a place like Europe where competition is low, and therefore the effect of increasing competition should be positive, whereas Autor et al. Are in the US where competition is high and increasing competition has a negative effect. I don't believe in that story, to be honest with you. I think there is something there that I don't understand. You will tell us later. And, but at least I'm very happy because both cite me, and I'm very happy, although I think It's always a problem when people cite you and you think they cite you for bad reasons. But we'll find out and see what happens. But it's interesting that those ideas are still there, you see, and they percolate now to trade economy. And those of you who do trade, I'm sure they know about Atkeson-Bernstein, who look at welfare effects of trade. But in Atkeson-Bernstein, you never have a competition effect. You only have a market size effect. And they find little welfare effect. But I bet you that if you put the competition effect on top, there you will find a welfare effect of trade on innovation. Okay? And this is things to be done now. Okay, that's my first enigma. You had a question. Maybe more than one question.
Well, I was just going to comment on this, the Bloom drug. I mean, so that paper also, it's one that you, they're missing some necessary fixed effects. You put these in.
Yeah.
The results are very sensitive.
Yeah.
That's all I wanted to say.
But there are people on both sides that said that there are problems with the other paper. So me, what we are doing now is to, with Melitz, we are redoing everything on French data, which are exhaustive. And we will look at that. And we think there are two kinds of things that are important. It's how frontier, non-frontier you are. And also if you are very downstream, upstream. We think that also might be important. Because if you are really using China as an input, it has a very different effect as if China is competing directly with your downstream output. But that we are in the process of doing it. Okay. Do you still alive? Are you still alive? That's my first enigma. I have two more. Then, okay. Okay, so back to here. Okay, so now let me talk about the middle income trap. The middle income trap, it was a bit this view. I mean, I motivated with Argentina, although it might not be the right motivation. I motivated saying, here is Argentina for you. Here I look at per capita GDP of Argentina divided by per capita GDP of US. And you see that between 1870 and 1930s, essentially Argentina grows at the same rate as US. Of course, the per capita GDP of Argentina is 40% of the per capita GDP of US, but they grow essentially at the same rate. And then they stop, they grow much less. Then there's what we call in French a décrochage. And that's a bit of a problem. And you want to understand that. But that goes beyond. It's a bit this view that, you know, you can grow fast for a while and then you stop growing. And we wanted to understand that. So, in fact, this was very much inspired for me by the competition work, but we went beyond. And this is based on work done with Acemoglu and Zelibotti, called Distance to Frontier, Selection and Economic Growth. In fact, when I came in the early 2000s at the new, it was already a celebration of New Economic School. I think it was the 10th anniversary then. I presented some stuff on this. And the idea there is to say, well, you see, you have two ways to generate productivity growth. Either you can catch up with what you call the leading edge, the frontier, in your sector or in the country. You know, the best practice, Nelson Phelps would call that. Okay, you catch up with the leading edge, or you innovate upon yourself. You were A, you become gamma A, where gamma is greater than 1. So this I call catching up or imitation, and this I call frontier innovation. And this is the growth rate of productivity, and small a is the ratio, of your A over the frontier A. So when small a is close to 0, you are very far from the frontier. When small a is close to 1, you are very close to the frontier, okay? And you can see from this right away that when you are very far from the frontier, you will privilege imitation, because that's what will give you the most growth. When you are very close to the frontier and small a is close to 1, you should privilege innovation. But it turns out that policies that foster catching up are not exactly the same policies as the one that foster frontier innovation. You see, if, for example, and then I will, for example, we already know competition. You remember competition, I already showed you, competition, if you are a country far from the frontier, most of your firm, if you're a country far from the frontier, one second. If you're far from the frontier, most of the firm would be orange firms. So then competition is not so important. You may even want to avoid it. But when you are a frontier country, most of your firms are blue firms, and then you want competition, it would foster growth. So already there, you can see that depending on how developed you are, you don't want to emphasize the same policy the same way. What we did with Aceboglu and Zilibotti is to generalize this idea, is to say, well, let's look at various policies. So there is one which is liberalizing the product market, competition, that we already know it's important. We show it in another way. Another one, we look at investment in higher education, and one is liberalization of labor market. But I could mention other ones. For example, finance. If you are in the business of catching up, it's enough to have bank finance. If you are in the business of frontier innovation, it's good to have venture capital, private equity, because it's very risky, low collateral. The financier wants to, to have a share of the upside, and he wants control rights initially. Venture capital will give it to you, okay? And so that's the thing. So for example, here, that's what we did, that's a regression we did with Zelibotti and Aceboglu, but it mirrors what I told you on competition using more micro data. Here on the left-hand side, you see you are looking here at the relationship between the initial GDP per capita relative to US in 1960, and there you are looking at the growth rate between 1960 and 2000. Usually, you should have a negative, because the closer you are to the frontier, the less you grow, because you've caught up already. We know that China grows faster than France could grow, because whenever China catches up, it makes a big advance, you see what I mean? Okay? Whereas when you're already frontier, you cannot make big advance. It's easier to reinvent the wheel than to invent the wheel, okay? So, that's normal. But what's very interesting is that if you look at countries, here on the left-hand side, I have the high barrier countries. On the left-hand side, I have the low barrier countries, which is the one which have more competition. And I look at barriers here using Jenkov et al. Measure of how much it costs to create a new firm. If you are far below the frontier, you see that these curves and these curves are equally high. But when you look on the right-hand side, you see that here you are much higher than there. You see? So that means that when you are far from the frontier, it's no big deal if you don't have barriers. But when you are close to the frontier, you lose a lot from not having, from having high barriers. So that tells you that when you get closer, you should increasingly remove barriers to competition. You should liberalize your product market. Here I show it cross-country. So the top part is just a cross-country regression. Here it's a cross-country panel regression, okay, with country fixed effect. And, but of course I showed that in the micro way with the Blondel thing, which I showed before. Okay, so that's no surprise. So that already gives you to a competition. You can have openness. I could have shown the same picture with openness. Instead of having high barrier, low barrier, I could use Frankel-Romer, that's David Romer. I can use Frankel-Romer measure of openness and high openness and low openness. How much you import and how much you are open to exports and import and how much you are not. And you could see exactly the same. The high openness, when they are close to frontier, they grow much higher rate than the low openness. So you see, and then you get a similar picture. Okay. Here is corruption. When you are far below frontier, it's no big deal to be corrupt. Here you would even think that it's good to be corrupt, but I'm not advocating corruption here. It would be very bad anywhere, by the way. But you see that what's important is that when you are close to frontier, you move to the right, the low corruption, they grow much faster than the high corruption. So corruption becomes, and why is corruption? Corruption is a way for the incumbents to put entry barriers. That's why corruption is bad. Corruption is a way for the vested interest to lobby, to prevent entry, you see? That's why you don't want corruption. And that becomes increasingly bad for growth when it's innovation that drives growth. When you are catching up country, but it's never good to have high corruption, but corruption is less of a problem. But when you want to become a truly innovation-based economy, corruption becomes truly a problem. Okay. Here is higher education. So this is based on work I did with Caroline Hoxby, cross-state panel US. And what we show is that when you are a state close to the frontier in terms of productivity, the highest productivity state nowadays is California. But then Massachusetts, Connecticut, all those guys are close to the frontier. But Mississippi, Alabama are far. And what you can show is that investing more in research education is very important when you are frontier. It's enough to invest in 2 years for your college when you are far below frontier. You see what I mean? But if you want to become an innovation-based economy, you have to invest more in graduate education. You don't do Silicon Valley without Stanford nearby. Okay. Here is democracy. So here it's a work I did with Alesina and Trebi, and I look at sectoral growth. And I look at sectoral growth in more democratic or less democratic country where I use the usual measures of polity for democracy. You know, openness of the political system and constraint on executive. When you are a sector far from frontier, no big deal if you are in a less democratic country. But when you are a frontier sector, it becomes very important to be in a more democratic country. You see, that's very interesting. Okay. And now, if you are an emerging market, you have other ways to grow. You rely on technology transfers, like China does. You reallocate factors, like China did, and you try to improve management practices. And there, you know, all the work that Bloom, Van Reenen, Sadoun, and others have done on management practices. They have this fantastic survey covering many countries, and they ask questions, and they get indicators for management practice. You see, US has very good management practice. France is behind. I don't know. Russia is not there. Oh, good. Yeah, I don't see Russia here. Tanzania, Ghana, of course, are at the bottom. Chile, Brazil are here. I would say that Russia should be there somehow. Italy is below France there. You see, and you get very much the one that you believe. And they show that there is, of course, a correlation between GDP per capita and management practice, but there, of course, the causality issue is obvious. But it's interesting, because that's a way also to improve productivity. Okay, so China grew very fast, trying to reallocate factors, to induce technology transfers, and to some extent to improve a bit management practice. And but now their fear is that they fear that they will face the middle income trap. That means that they will get at a stage where they should move to more innovation-based policies, and they cannot do it. And the reason why can't they do it? They cannot do it because of what Fabrizio said in his presidential address at the EA almost 2 years ago, is that, you see, what happens is that here I represent my TFP divided by A bar last period, my small a at the last period, that's my small a on the vertical axis is small at, and what you want is to maximize at over at minus 1, but here is the kind, if I had a policy which favors mu m, that's a policy which would favor mu n, the innovation based. Whenever you are far below frontier, it could well be that you want to favor more like large-scale investment, large firms. You see economies of scale, like when Russia did, okay, under Stalin and after, okay. That's what Korea did. That's why Japan did. And you can go fast. You see, you imitate and you do large scale. And but at some moment, it becomes better for growth to move to innovation-based, that means liberalized product market, liberalized labor market, because when you do frontier innovation, but you need competition to induce you to innovate, you need competition because you need entry and exit, you need flexible labor market because you need to adapt labor and hire and lay off easily, you need market finance more than bank finance, graduate school, blah, blah, blah. But you need, but the problem, so ideally what you would like to do is to say, well, when I am far from the frontier, I do the investment base, and then I do the transition there. But the problem is that this does not happen. And in fact, very, very typically, you will remain there too long, and you will pass this point, which is the 45-degree line, and when you pass this point, you get stuck there. So you would have learned to move there and then go to there, but you can never get to there. You get stuck here. And why are you stuck? Because in fact, during the catching up phase, large conglomerates emerged. And the large conglomerates, they prevent, not only they try to prevent entry of new firms, but they prevent the move towards innovation base. They don't want policies like that. So in Korea, you have the chaebols. In Japan, you have the keiretsus. I never know how to write keiretsus. I don't know if someone is from Japan. Okay? And here you have the oligarchs. Okay? And the problem is that these guys, not only they prevent entry, but they don't want to move to a system which would make entry easy, that would make it, and that's how you can get stuck. You see what I mean? And that's the problem, is that in the process of catching up, you create big mastodon, big pachyderm, and the big pachyderm, not only they block entry of new people, they block the necessary move to innovation-based policies. And that's the difficulty. Korea had one piece of luck, and I'm doing that with Sergei Gurayev. It's a paper we are doing together. We are showing that the financial crisis had a good effect on Korea. It weakened the chaebols. They receive a blow on their head, boom! So their entry went up, and you can see that. When you have the financial crisis hitting Korea, suddenly the chaebols are weakened and entry can resume. It's fantastic. So there is a good side to financial crisis. I don't advocate financial crisis, but in the case of Korea, it was very helpful. Okay? That's a very interesting curve from Fabrizio. So here Fabrizio shows, okay, China, they want to invest a lot in R&D. And they say, okay, that's big money. And in a sense they say, well, it's okay if we don't have much democracy in China, because, you know, we can give money and money makes up for everything, okay? But it's not enough to give money, you see, because here I'm looking at Chinese firms and Taiwanese firms, and I'm looking at their TFP growth as a function of how close they are to the frontier. So you know that more or less you should get a negative. But the blue one are the non-R&D firms, and the red one are R&D firms that receive R&D subsidies. You see that in China, it makes no difference. I don't know what they do with the R&D subsidies. They buy Malabar, Carambar, or chocolates. I don't know what they do with it. You don't see any difference, okay? Whereas in Taiwan, you see that the R&D intensive, they can, to some extent, counteract the growth rate going down when they approach the frontier. You see what I mean? And that shows that R&D policy is much more effective in Taiwan than it is in China. So it's not just money, it's governance. And maybe what they have there is they have competition, they have more things that they don't have in China. It was a big debate 4 years ago. It was with we went to, with Daron Acemoglu and others, we went to China. And they asked us, what do you think we should do? They're afraid of the middle income trap. They know they have to do something to become truly innovation. They innovate in various areas. They say, what should we do? So Daron more or less was telling them, disband the Communist Party. But I was being caricaturing, okay? And I said, look, I don't know what you should do. But what I know is that competition is important, academic freedom is important. You need those guys. How you will deliver them, it's up to you. I am not there to patronize you, okay? Maybe you find another way. In the West, we make it, although, you know, US is not a model, as you know, antitrust is much weaker than before, and there are many things that go wrong there and in other countries, okay? But what we do is that we have a judiciary which is independent, and that's a way to enforce antitrust. If you don't have an independent judiciary, It's very hard to have antitrust. They tell us the Communist Party can play that role. I don't know. Me, I'm a bit dubious. But look, I'm not close-minded. If they find their way, they find their way. But I tell them, those are the ingredients, find a way to deliver them. But if you don't have competition, if you don't have academic freedom, etc., you will be very hard for you to get there. Well, voilà. That's, now how you do it, it's up to you. Find an experiment, try things. You will find ways we didn't think about. And they had also this view, which I don't believe in, that you can have no freedom, but you create a Novosibirsk. You see what I mean? You create a place where researchers are very happy, they can watch movies, they can have fun. The rest of the country is completely under scrutiny, but they are in a kind of bubble, and that's enough to create an innovation-based economy. I don't believe in that personally, but that's a debate. That's an open debate we can have, you see. Well, can you have innovation based in bubbles, and the rest? But those are big debates, you see. Voilà. That's a country that does not reform. That's a country that reforms. Japan has not reformed. Well, it's not a middle-income country, but it has a transition problem, and it has this famous keiretsus that I mentioned there. And you see, China was growing very fast, and since the 90s, Japan, is not growing, or very little, because they cannot make these reforms. They have an aging population, which doesn't help either, because usually you need a young population. See, Macron is young. You need young people to do things. So it's not enough, but it helps. Sometimes you have young people, but anyway. So Sweden made reforms in the early 90s. They made reforms in the tax system. They had a tax system which was discouraging innovation. They managed to change the tax system without destroying their social model. That's a very interesting example. The growth rate, you see, for example, if you look at Sweden, TFP growth, it was multiplied by 4 or 5 almost before and after the reforms that they did. It's true that they did not only do the tax reform, they also devalued the currency. Of course, that helped. But that's very interesting that when you do reforms, it works. You see what I mean? Reforms pay out. And that's what you can see in Sweden. Sweden is just fantastic. And my hope is that Macron would do that what Sweden has done. You see, that would be great. With Hollande, it was more like Japan. You see what I mean? Voilà. That was France. You see, like boom, 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 boom. France, moving like at speed 0, 5 miles per hour. Voilà. Anyway, so that's the middle income trap. Okay. So now let me talk about growth and firm dynamics. So that's the last thing I want to mention, and then I think maybe we stop and we take some questions, okay? The empirical literature has documented various stylized facts on firm size distribution and firm dynamics using micro firm level data. In particular, 3 facts they have pointed out is the first, that the firm size distribution is highly skewed. That means you have a lot. I will draw it on the whiteboard, but if you look at the size of firms, it looks very much like this. Let me do it here. If you look at the size of firms, you would find firm size and the distribution. You have many small and very few large. It's a highly skewed distribution of firms.
How do you measure the size of firm here?
You measure size of firm by employment, but you could measure also by number of products, and usually they go together.
Not revenue profit.
Sorry?
Not revenue profit.
Some people measure by revenues and profits, but here usually measure. So I look at Alti Wanger, this kind of people, how they measure firm size. Typically employment, but usually it's commonotonic with other measures. So the second thing is that firm size and firm age tend to be highly positively correlated. Typically, older firms tend to be larger than younger firms. Okay. A third thing is that small firms tend to exit more frequently than large firms. There is other facts like small firms do bigger innovations in terms of citations. Okay. So you want a model to explain that. Voilà, here is your file size distribution. And there is a framework which was very attractive, and that has been the kind of main extension. So I can say with Howitt, we did our basic model in 92, then I did a competition model to get the inverted U, and I can say that not much happened on the theoretical side on Schumpeterian models until a model by Clété and Kortum. And so let me write Clété, Kortum. Clété and Kortum, and it's in the GP 2004. Okay, and that model, it's a model where you can talk about firm size and firm growth. So how does it work? It works that a firm is a collection of products. Okay? And a firm can have one product or two products. How do firms innovate in their model? A firm goes into a line. I will draw it here at the same time. So I will draw it with a blue, actually. So I have a firm. Here is my firm. But then I have products which are not in my firm. So this is my firm today. And that's the A. And each time you innovate, you go from A to gamma A, where gamma is greater than 1. So how do I expand as a firm? I innovate on some other line, and I go from there, and I improve to A to gamma A. I improve by gamma. And if I do that successfully, I was a firm of size 3, I become a firm of size 4, where here the size of the firm is measured by the number of products. But I may also be replaced. Someone else may creatively destroy me here. And then I shrink. I go from size 3 to size 2. So it's a model where you can have firm expansion, firm shrinkage, and entry. What is entry? Somebody who is nobody, and suddenly you are from nobody and you innovate upon that guy, but then you become a one-line firm. You understand? And how do you exit? Is that you had only one firm, F prime, had only one line, and someone innovates upon that line, that firm disappears. So it's a model with creative destruction, it's a Schumpeterian model, but we can have entry, exit, and firm growth. You see what I mean? Okay? And the model is very cool because it allows you to understand the fact. First, you can show that the firm size distribution will be skewed. Why? Because you have many small. Why do you have very few large firms? You have very few large firms because to be a large firm, you need first to have been small, then to survive several creative destruction. Maybe you went up and down, you went like this, and you moved to large. And you see, it took many luck and events for you to become large. So of course, the probability of getting there is very small, whereas it's much higher to enter first. So this model generates right away and beautifully an ergodic distribution of firm size, which is exactly like this one. Okay? You understand the intuition? Second thing, firm size and firm age are positively correlated. But of course, because you start small, you start with one line. And it takes you a while to get bigger. So already, right away, almost by construction, it gives you that, on average, firm size and firm age are correlated. And why is the exit rate higher on small firms than high firm? Because if you are a one-line firm, it takes only one creative destruction for you to disappear. If you have 3 lines, it takes 1 plus 1 plus 1, which never happens at the same time. So the probability that it will happen to you is much lower. You see what I mean? And that's why you have that exit is much more frequent on small firms than other. So that's a very nice model. And in fact, there's been a lot of work using the Clété-Kortum. Wu Fuk in particular has been trying every kind of extension you can imagine with the Clété-Kortum model. Okay? And that has been really the major theoretical development on Aghion and Howitt. I mean, that respectable. And so the people now, and it's very interesting because you can talk about growth and development in this way. So there is a very interesting paper by Say and Clino on China and India, but there is also a very interesting paper by Aksigit, Alp, and Peters. And the pictures by Say and Clino are like this. Here they show in a 2009 paper, they show the relationship between 9 or 14, I want to make sure, I think it's 14. They show the relationship between firm size and firm age. And they measure firm size by number of employees. You can see that India, they stop growing very fast. They don't grow for very long. Whereas US, they grow faster. And Mexico is in between, and France is where Mexico is. And I suspect Russia is where Mexico is. Okay, you could do that with Russia. It would be very interesting that you reproduce that with Russia, if you don't do it already. I'd be surprised if one of you is not doing it already. Okay? Now, the story that you could develop for India, and it's more or less the story that Peters and Alp and Aksigit developed, is that in India, you don't trust anybody, because there is no enforceable rule of law or whatever. So you only trust brother-in-law. When you run out of brothers-in-law, you stop growing your firm. You see what I mean? So it's and so they stop growing fast. Whereas in the US, you trust managers, because if the manager screws up, you can sue him or sue her and get compensations and all that. But there are other things also. So the idea there is that when you are very good, you can grow more in the US than you can grow in India. You see what I mean? Alors, you can grow more. I mentioned one story, because you can trust managers. You have the human capital. But you could have another idea, it's credit. Maybe, an impediment to grow is lack of human capital, lack of rule of law, of enforcement, but also a lack of credit can be a problem. And it may prevent people to grow. But in fact, that explains two things. In the US, you have two things that contribute to this positive relationship between the firm size and firm age. Is first that when I have credit in the US and I can grow when I'm good, okay, I find the money. In particular because I have the venture capital. But in addition, there is a selection process in the US. When you are very good and you can grow, you can grow over other people who are not as good. So the share of employment, here is the share of employment by aging firms. So typically the firms that age in the US are typically firms that are good, because if you are not good in the US, you die. So if you survive, it's because you are good. But if you are good, you can take over other people who are not that good. So it's both the fact that if I'm good, I can finance myself, but I can also Darwinianly survive over other people, and selection works. So this positive relationship between firm age and firm size in the US reflects both that you get access to finance and that selection operates better in the US. In India, because you cannot grow much, you see, selection doesn't operate well either. And that curve that I show here reflects in curves in terms of distribution of firm productivity. You see, that's again from Clino and Say, India versus China. You can see that in US, you have almost no firms with low productivity. They don't see that because they are swallowed. Either you die or you are bought back. You see? Whereas in India, because good people cannot grow much, they leave room for less efficient people. And that's why less efficient firms can survive better. So if the relationship between age and size in India could become like in US, the distribution of productivities in India would move to the right similarly. Those are mirrors of each other. But you could try this exercise for Russia. And you could look at how various reforms, be it on education, be it on product market competition, be it on labor market mobility, be it on on infrastructure, would move both. You see, you would like to see how Russia is here and how Russia is here. And look at the various reforms and see how they affect those curves. Do you see what I mean? That's what you're doing?
I haven't done it.
You have done it? So please, I give you the floor. So I think that's the thing. So that links my middle income trap with this literature. The middle income trap tells you that as you move closer to frontier, you should do more labor market mobility, blah, blah, blah. But here it translates into the firm dynamics. You see what I mean? A lot of the growth effects of these policies will work through their effects on the firm dynamics and on the size, on the distribution of firms in the productivity. So in fact, the future is to merge the part that I did on middle income trap with this part, where you look at how various reforms affect this curve and the previous one. You see what I mean? That's what I So, conclusion, here we have proposed a new growth paradigm, but also a new way to do growth theory, which means in terms of a dialogue between microdata and model, and that's what people do. Now, Ufuk, for example, would do that all the time himself, but we started that with Blondel. We go back and forth between modeling and microdata, and so it's both testing predictions of the models, but it's also calibrating models, of course, and it's doing these various things there, okay? Alors, we managed to revisit enigmas such as competition and growth and the implication for trade. I talked about the middle income trap. It's not only middle income, it's what I would call more generally transition trap, because Japan is not a middle income country. France has exactly the same problem as Japan. We grow very fast during the 30 years after World War II, between 45 and 75, and then we stop growing. And now France is having the same problem, and Macron is facing the union. You see, we try to reform the railways, and it's a big problem that we have. And we have to reform that as well. And France is facing similar problem. And growth and firm dynamics is the last one that I mentioned, because I think they're very important to, for example, again, Ufuk and Salome Bazdanze and Francesca Lotti have a very interesting paper on Italy, where they show that as firms grow, they invest less and less in R&D and more in political connections. And that's how they survive, and it's beautiful. You see that beautifully. Let me show you the diagram. 1 second. Bear with me. Let me show you. It's so nice. 1 second. Look, it's a nice. I can't miss this one. Samsung, blah blah blah. Hey, ideas. Oh la la, you will see this. Oh la la. It's so nice. I'm sure you can have the same with Russia. Look at this paper. That was a discussion of ideas harder to get by Jones and Al. I don't know if you know that paper. This is the best discussion given of that paper. That's what people tell me. That's what the authors told me. But they wanted to be nice to me. That's from Ufuk paper. Look, look at this picture. Look at this. This is, you see, firms market rank. So when you are more to the left, your market share is very high, okay? And the triangles are the politicians per labor, okay, hired, and the local politicians, and the squares are the patent per labor. And you see, when you are low market rank, you mean you are small firm, you invest a lot in R&D, the squares are very high and the triangles are very low. And when you become high market share, it's exactly the other way around. You invest mostly on politicians and very little on labor. And you find again my contradiction. You know, you became big probably because you innovated, but once you innovated, essentially you increase increasingly in lobbying, in political links, to keep your market power and prevent subsequent people to come. And the whole problem is that you have a political system that favors that, or that makes that difficult. And that's where institutions are so important. And I think I'll stop there.
Okay, thank you very much.
I wanted just to announce what waits for you, what will be the next. So don't miss tomorrow. Don't miss, oh God, where is my... oh yes, no, then it's very bad. Where lecture? Which one is my lecture? EM lecture? No. Which one is mine?
Do you have USB key inserted?
No, yeah, but I wanted what is on your C drive. Oh, is it there? Agion? You don't have Agion there. PowerPoint, Microsoft. No. Yeah, but you don't have in your disk? Yeah, no, it's not there. It's not, no, it's in yours. No, Olga is not there. Lecture. No, that's Bretton Woods. Yeah, it's okay, don't worry. So tomorrow, don't worry about that. Tomorrow I will be talking about, tomorrow I talk about Gordon and growth measurement. And the day after tomorrow I talk about inequality and why I'm different from Piketty, what's different from Piketty and I, okay? And argue that he doesn't have the right model of growth and inequality, okay? And that's we conclude. I think I'm done with this.
Let's have a few minutes for questions, and then we'll stop for today. So, any questions? Yes.
So, Philip,
Yeah.
thank you for the beautiful lecture. So, one thing is that you know, you mentioned for managerial practices, but you know, you brought kind of trade, and you know, if I push in that direction, trade and geography, market access, doesn't matter.
Market access.
Market access, yes. So maybe one of the later pictures, US is a very large market with you know, low transportation cost.
And that's why they grow more, you mean?
Yeah, exactly. Any kind of additional innovation
That's why
gives
firms-
a larger kind of weight here. And that itself might explain it.
That's why you have the curve higher on the firm dynamics, you mean? That's why that adjusts the market.
For instance.
Firms would grow more with with age because they have bigger prospects for. It's interesting. But it's interesting also it's the firm dynamics there. So it's important to see how you could decompose between selection and the other thing. You say just it could be that they grow more because they can sell more, in a sense.
Oh, faster, yeah. So they can put the, you know, capture the markets, capture the profits, this demand faster.
Than other firms that would, but that's assuming that they have a very protected market and some firm size. So it would be interesting to correct that for firm size, for size of the economy, you mean, and see that whether it's just, but India is big as well, and China is big. So
No, but
size
then-
of the
but
market.
then it's something that is kind of hidden there, is that, you know, different sectors, different firms in different
No, but I
sectors.
agree with you that it could be that infrastructure helps. So it would be nice to look at various aspects. Would infrastructure improvement play, would education play, would competition play, and how that would affect the curve. I think that's an interesting topic. It's not size per se only, because China is big and India is big, and you see that you don't have the same growth.
More questions?
Okay, let us stop today. Thanks again, Philippe.
Thank you.
Tomorrow.
I'll see you tomorrow.